Greetings and welcome to Gaming Ballistic's Firing Squad. We are here with Richard LeBlanc and David Welborn from New Big Dragon Games Unlimited. They've graciously agreed to join me and talk largely about the D30 Sandbox Companion, which has taken the role-playing world, at least in miniature, by storm. Where did it hit on the RPGNow, was it?
That's where we released the PDF, was through RPGNow, and I think as of this evening, it was going back and forth between #1 and #2 today, with a maps release for just a couple of bucks. So it's hard to compete with like 6 maps for $2. So, but I think right now we're back at #1, but it's been 3 weeks straight since its release.
Sort of the role-playing equivalent of the New York Times bestseller list, I suppose.
If you prefer, you know what? It's funny. I think Drive-Thru RPG must be the more OSR-oriented one, because they actually track OSR sales separately, but we did this release through RPGNow. So, but yeah, it's sort of like the Wall Street Journal, only, yeah, right, very limited.
So tell me a little bit more about this. So I reviewed it a little bit on my blog, and Eric Tenkar raved about it, which led me to take a look at it, and I looked at it again. So tell me a little bit how the Sandbox Companion came about, because it's a really interesting idea, and we'll get into why it's really cool and interesting later. But it seems really interesting. How did the ideas occur to you guys, and how did you bring it to fruition?
It really is tied directly into my beginning with blogging back in 2011, because early on when I sort of launched the blog, I wasn't even really posting. I was just using it to start following other people's blogs, because I would open a blog account so I could follow other, particularly OSR blogs, and was looking for stuff to start putting up. And my very first post ever, when I decided, okay, it's time to do a post, I had a wild hair to write a D30 based RPG, because I didn't see that anybody had done it before or done it effectively. And in developing a D30 set of mechanics, I started looking at how the D30 could be used as a D5, a D6, D10, D15, D2. It was very flexible as a die, and started sort of putting some of the things that were supposed to be charts in this game out as downloads on the blog, and it just had some stickiness. Sort of the D30 thing people responded to, and I mean, I only really kind of thought about the D30 thing because I had seen other OSR bloggers doing the Order of the D30. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with that thing that happened sort of 2008, 2009. I don't want to get too far into that background, but I can in a minute. So I was just doing these D30 charts, and I decided every Friday would be a D30 chart day. So I just started doing all these charts for download, and before I knew it, I had these sort of dungeon-themed ones. Mushrooms, molds, traps, poisons, magic items. And so that's how the D30 DM Companion happened, which was the first D30 book. And then just started, as Dave was helping me really finish up polishing on the content on that one, I was still putting out new D30 charts, but those D30 charts were not dungeon related. They were very wilderness driven. And so all of a sudden, the D30 DM Companion hadn't even come out yet, and I announced the Sandbox Companion, which was a little premature. And now I know how those guys who kind of go out there with these Kickstarter ideas but without the completed thing ready to go feel, because then it took us almost 2 years from the time I said, hey, there's going to be this D30 Sandbox Companion, to finish it.
Yeah, I've learned a bit of the folly of that on a much smaller scale. I do writing for Pyramid Magazine, and I get myself into more trouble sending Stephen Marsh hey, I'm thinking of this idea, as opposed to, here's a finished article, I hope you like it.
That's a little bit how it sort of happened, but the other thing that happened is, as we started adding charts, as I was sort of developing new charts, and getting Dave's feedback from that, more charts kept happening. And so what was originally intended to only be about 30 or 35 pages ended up at 52. Because in the meantime, I said, you know what, I just was looking for other stuff to do for the blog, so I did this wilderness map, this hex crawl mapping thing, because I had done a week on the blog where I'd focused on hex crawls and just put a map out there, put this worksheet out there, a couple of resources like that. and people started downloading the hex crawl worksheet. And so I said, oh, well, I'll do some other worksheets. And then we started developing the charts so they work directly with the worksheets. But the whole time it was, this thing, when it's done, it's going to be very sort of like, be able to fill in the blank for your wilderness and just be able to respond to players.
Right, and the interesting thing, at least for me, is I'm getting older. I've got one child, got another one, sort of information, and you just run out of time. But I still do want a game, and the thing that's really interesting about this is that and we'll get into this in a little bit because as always, this is some background for readers. I always send my interviewees the questions that we're going to ask as a discussion guide. I also think it's polite. But one of the things that we pass back and forth is some of the adventure seeds from the book. I will talk a little bit about more of that, but there are 3 of them that we'll maybe talk through. But it's like, oh, I'm stuck for a plot today, so let me roll D30 a couple of times. And, oh, look, here's an episode, and all I need is some orcs and an NPC, and it's very directed, and with a little bit of imagination, all of a sudden you have the evening's plot. As a matter of fact, I was so inspired by this that I've decided that I'm going to do every Sunday, I think, the Sandbox Companion Adventure of the Week, where I'm going to... and because it's so easy. It's so easy, and it's so interesting, and why not? So anyway... and just to sort of get into it a little bit, so you talked a little bit about the interest of D30. Did you ever consider like D6 times D6 or any of that, or you just have this fascination with D30s and must exploit it?
Well, that's it more than anything. In junior high, my best friend, who I dragged into a few games but was by no means a regular gamer like I was, went on a family trip to Colorado and came back from some big hobby store at some huge mall in Denver with an Armory smoky clear D30 that I've had ever since, basically. So that's my third.
That is the source of inspiration for all things. It's like the Orb of Elder if you're an Eddings fan.
Yeah, but he also brought me the Armory's charts, which have at some point I've been meaning for a long time to actually review the charts on my blog, but I would feel like I'm bashing them because it's a poor excuse to buy a D30 to have these charts because there's not much in them, and there's stuff that we actually were going to do in the Sandbox Companion that was similar to some of these charts that Dave goes, this feels like fluff. This just feels like absolute fluff, and we cut. And so anyway, I'd always been fascinated. I did my first D30 chart like a week after I got the D30 in this book, and it was a to-hit area chart. Hand-drawn, little kid, legal-size paper kind of stuff. So that fascination never went away, but when I discovered the OSR blogosphere, it was sort of an excuse to bring it back out. And it was my fascination that had never gone away just sort of like immediately came back. And so, sorry, I got a little off track from the question, but
that's okay.
Yeah, and it's not that we thought of doing it this way, but being the D30, it does tend to differentiate the product from the rest of there's other books of lists out there.
Sure.
And charts.
Well, the other thing was, and Dave's the guy who basically always sort of stays on my butt about being good about this, and that is to really use the D30 to its full effectiveness, because in the Sandbox Companion, both in the DM and Sandbox Companions, there are a lot of 5x6 matrix charts where one roll creates two sets of results, and you roll and you check the header on the column and the sidebar on the row, and you actually have two results from a single roll. And the 6x6 can do that, but you're sort of having to put one set of dice down and pick up another dice if you're mixing it with D20s, for example.
Sure.
And so that flexibility is something that we just never questioned early on. The reason the D30 Sandbox Companion is a D30 book is because it wasn't developed to be a Sandbox Companion originally. It was a set of charts that came out of using the D30. It just happened to be really damn useful.
Well, a lot of PhD theses are nothing but 4 or 5 published papers stapled together. So, you're in good company. So you guys have gone back and forth just a little bit. What is your 2 roles, David and Richard, in New Big Dragon Games?
I'll actually let Dave kind of talk to that because I think he can give you a better insight of sort of where I drag him in.
Right. Well, I've always been kind of a sounding board. Richard and I actually tried to put together a band early on, and so he was always writing the songs, and I was there as sort of sideman, and giving my input and sort of like, this part of the song is like top notch, and this part of the song just isn't up to everything else, right? And so we had this sort of working creative relationship, and somewhere in there, I got married, he got married, no time for bands anymore, and Richard discovered this OSR thing and was sort of showing it to me, and it's weird. He gave me a module he was working on to just sort of proofread to make sure he didn't make any big typographical errors or just check it out, and we just sort of fell into kind of the same working relationship that we had prior, and he's pretty much the engine, and I sounding board and sort of honest opinion.
Yeah, because there are times where it's like this just doesn't work, or this is clunky. And honestly, one of the reasons, and I'm going to out Dave a little bit on this reason for the Sandbox Companion taking so long. Dave has 2 twin boys that are what, 2.5, almost 3 now.
They're 3 now. Yeah.
3. Okay,
they were 2
for a whole year. 2, and they were 2 for a whole year.
But it seems like longer.
Both of them at the same time.
And as they got out of toddler stage, or they're still toddler basically, but as they got out of that infant stage into toddler stage, required a lot more of his attention, especially later in the evening.
Yeah.
Tended to slow up the process a lot. So what's funny is that because I really needed Dave's input on some of these charts and whether they were working, because like the 2 of us together completely rewrote the NPC, the henchman hireling charts that are in the book, as well as the weather charts that are in the book, a couple of times before the versions you see in the book. A lot of that kind of stuff had to happen. And because we were waiting so long, or because I was waiting for Dave in some cases, I actually put out 2 modules in the meantime. And so, I did the Valley of the Five Fires module, which is like a 56-page Mongol-inspired OSR setting, and this little 12, 16-page Egyptian sort of little one-shot thing. And that was in between sort of all the other times where we weren't working. So that's 2 things. That's the amount of attention we put to making sure these charts worked, and
an amount of care, right? We didn't want to just throw it out. We wanted to.
Sure. So you've mentioned, and obviously the D30 Sandbox is very much centered around the old school revival OSR. Why is that important to you, right? I played D&D. I remember the red box. I think I got the blue box. I think I may have even been given them both at the same time. I got into AD&D, and then I think in high school, and this would have been sort of an 85 to 89, I played a whole bunch of stuff because my my friend Ken Capelli and Mark Worthy and those guys were sort of the game of the week or game of the month. Did Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay for a while. Eventually they introduced me to GURPS, and that was almost the last system we played before I went to college. And then what I found there is I was playing, actually I think it was the Dark Conspiracy setting, and loved the setting, couldn't really deal with the rules, and so then I got into GURPS big time, sort of converting it on the fly. My first game was 15 world books, but so now we find ourselves in 2014, old school revival. So why do you guys find that compelling to write for?
I really kind of was away from the hobby for a long time because as there's nothing that really turns, and I don't want to offend your GURPS viewers here, but there's very little that sort of, there's very little that turns me off more than a lot of splat, in terms of splat books. And it's why I've never been able to, like, comprehend Palladium. Not that I don't comprehend Palladium, but Palladium RPG and GURPS to some degree are sort of like, here's the library of stuff that you need to kind of go through depending on the game you want to play. And even D&D got a lot like that, and it's one of the reasons that sort of turned me off at some points about D&D. And I am not a 3 or 3.5 player or 4. Dave's a 3.5 guy. So so I had done other RPG stuff off and on in the 90s, and then the early part, 2000 to 2008, really hadn't done much. And so discovering the OSR was bringing me back to the stuff that I'd loved early on. And that's one of the reasons I think, for a lot of us it's nostalgia, but for a lot of us it's just we like that style of play. And I missed that, and it was nice to kind of get back to it.
David?
I also was away from the hobby a lot. I think I played in elementary school in the early 80s, and didn't play again until college. So somewhere in high school, I was introduced to Call of Cthulhu and Paranoia, Car Wars, right? Kind of hit there, but then went off to college and didn't really play much except when it was D&D. Played some of the superhero RPGs, but it was like we just couldn't put together the time regularly with all the people and the school workload. And then a bunch of my college buddies, one of them moved back to, the guy who was the DM moved back to town, and around 2000, and we just started cranking it out. And he, the guy is just a genius at storytelling, and third edition was just the vehicle, And so, but OSR came around, and it really kind of with Richard pulling me into it, kind of realizing that the way we played the modern rule sets were very old school in a way, but much more like the conversation you were having in the other Ballistic interview, much more narrative based rather than the simulation kind of rules.
Sure. And in my own experience, and it's interesting, the one of the best and longest running games that I had going, first in college and then honestly in grad school as well, was D6 Star Wars. And the nice thing about that is an incredibly simple rule set. I believe at the time it won a bunch of awards, and in my opinion deserved them. But the thing is about Star Wars is probably the same thing that's good or interesting or really binding about the OSR is it's a fairly narrow rule set in a world or a style of play that everybody gets. Everyone understands, at least of anything our generation, and frankly the next generation as well with the new movies. Say what you will about them, and there's lots to say. Han shot first. And that's even the old ones. You can even ruin perfectly good stuff. It's like new rules editions. There's an analogy to be made here between the continual revision of the old Star Wars movies and what we actually go and play. But in a way, that's what it is you go back and you say, okay, hack and slash fantasy, and I mean that in the nicest possible way because I play a lot of it. It's something everyone understands, and you go back to the old box D&D or even AD&D, and you say, this is just a fairly straightforward way, and we can create our worlds and play in them. And Star Wars is the same way. You can go inhabit that world, as opposed to doing all the work. And it's wonderful, and it's deep, and I want to see a movie in it. But wow, I approached David Pulver's Transhuman Space with fear and shock and awe because I just couldn't penetrate it. I couldn't figure out how to play in it. But I know how to get a cleric, a fighter, a magic user, another fighter, a thief, and another fighter in, and kill some damn orcs. right? And so you know what to do there, and it's what are we going to do today? Oh, we'll go northwest and kill more orcs or whatever, right? So we'll branch out tomorrow. We'll kill goblins, and so I think that's one of the things that's compelling, is for especially for time strat people. There's a certain style of play that you can get together and do, and it doesn't require method. It doesn't require a lot of I don't want to say investment, because you can have a lot of fun and you can inhabit the characters, but it just doesn't require quite so much overhead.
Well, it takes real work to create a universe that has sort of internal rigor that's believable, that just doesn't become
Right.
gonzo.
Correct. And I will give mad props to Transhuman Space as an example for doing exactly that. But boy, there's a reason why the introductory adventures start way the heck away from Earth and all the complexities of the third, fourth, fifth wave, whatever. You got to start by killing orcs so that you can understand the setting. But coming back to the D30 Sandbox Companion, just because that's the point. All right, it took me 5, maybe 10 minutes to open up Excel, drop the 30 column headings in, and hit a random number generator. And I did the math because I'm a dork. There are 590 trillion potential adventure seeds that come out of those 2 pages of text.
Yeah, I think we actually referenced that in the introduction to the sandbox. But
Right.
so go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
No. I was gonna. Hey, it's your interview, not mine. But the thing is at the push of a button, I've got an idea, and so what I wanted to do, if you're willing, and if we can take the time, is I wanted to throw up 1 or 2 or 3. We'll see where this goes, because it could take a while, of these ideas, and I had sent them out ahead of time. But see where they took me, and see where 2 different people took each one. If you're willing to indulge me for a moment.
Absolutely.
So let's do this. I'll PowerPoint it, unfortunately. So the first bit, and for those who don't have the book, shame on you, and go buy it, because for what you get, it's worth it. There are 10 categories, sort of major plot points or axes, and each table has 30 different pieces, and so what you see here is randomly generated bit. You've got adventure trigger is a drawing of some sort, major goal, devastation, scavenger hunt, city pedestal, etc., etc. And so what I did with this one is, to me, the drawing implied a map or a picture. Disembodied voices, mystery, Queen Mother as the key NPC. This started to sound to me like divination, predicting the future. The geographic. I'm sorry. My parents were both English majors, so I have to fix that spelling error.
Okay.
The geographic features are really neat, because it's the I remember in the Frank Miller Batman Year 1 book, Batman talks about the one distinctive detail, and he puts on a scar so that people would do that. And the geographic part of this, that there's a pillar in the center of a city somewhere, was really interesting. It's such a great little bit of flavor. So there's a pillar in the center of a city. The pillar is beautiful, artistic, and probably magical. Maybe it was even there before the city was there. The Queen started painting scenes of terrible destruction, and her close confidants are reporting that she's talking to herself, talking in her sleep. She wasn't an artist, but she is now. And maybe she's even using techniques that only exist in modern 2014. Maybe it's pointillism, maybe it's a perspective, maybe it's 3D looking stuff where that didn't exist in this time. And the court is disturbed because they're really worried about this, and they're worried about the Queen's sanity, but the King knows his wife to be a pretty stable person, and so, but the council won't let him commit forces or troops to protect the city. The Queen recently completed another drawing, a giant catastrophe being averted by a powerful figure standing on the pillar. The figure's cloaked in black and gold, distinctive bracelet with an outstretched hand. That hand and the bracelet are in the King's treasure room. it's a lost relic on display, very clearly visible. And it's known as the Hand of the King. It's one of the royal treasures. It's probably the thing that he holds up during coronation. So the Queen contacted the party of adventurers, having made a leap of faith that the hand is part of a larger statue, which, if placed on the pillar, will protect the entire city, and they have to do that before disaster strikes. And that's the scavenger hunt piece of it. So why else is she getting these instructions? And hey, you know, people, the voices are talking to her. That's a little crazy, and that's why the council is skeptical, and why they have to branch out to the random murder hobos and have them go trace down the pieces of the statue. So that's where this took me, and so, you know, it was just one of these things where you start putting the different pieces together, and it was really, really, really interesting. And then as we get into the next two, you find out that you can really tie all of these together into an overarching campaign. So what do you guys make of this thing?
Dave, you want to go first? Or you want me to go first? Did you have time to kind of work on this at all, or?
We've lost Dave's sound.
I'm sorry, I'm on mute. I was.
He has a tendency to mute himself, by the way.
My wife wishes I would have that tendency.
This happens a lot when we Skype. I'll hear this long period of silence and go, "Dude, I think you're on mute."
Yeah. So I took this somewhere else. I went with a heist theme. So you had a guy. He was out sort of pretending to be a sort of a street artist. He had like his sketchbook, and he was drawing, say, like the equivalent of a bank on the street. And what he was really doing while he was doing that was he's sort of casing the joint. And something happens, and he loses his sketchbook. And the player party character, the PC party finds that sketchbook, and it's got the bank. It's got maybe some portraits of his friends and maybe the insides of some taverns and some phenomena around town, and that brings into the scavenger hunt aspect that you're having to go around the town and try and figure out perhaps who this guy was, and what was going on. The disembodied voices are coming, say, from the sewer, which, you know, leads people down below ground, which is, you know, sewers are sort of part and parcel to heist adventures, and they're going to try and get the figurine or idol from the vault in this basically Tower of London or bank type place, and it's a figurine or idol that is was the basis of the sculpture that sits atop the pedestal in the middle of the city, and that's going to be used by the bad guy who actually hired the bank robbers to destroy the royalty of the town and bring everything down.
Cool. You know what? I think what I might want to do here, just for time's sake. Now, actually, you know what, Richard? You go to town. What do you have on? What do you have in mind?
I started this one thing that I completely abandoned because I don't know if it's because I sort of saw all the answers on this one at one time or not. Because I was like trying to sort of I tend to want to over-tie everything together and oversimplify, not oversimplify, but over-complexify, you know, make it really too complex, honestly. So I had one where there was this pedestal in the middle of town, but the thing that happened in that direction where I took it, it was on the feast of it was on this day called the Feast of the Hunt, where young adults in the town were sort of drawn out of a lottery. So in this case, the drawing was not a physical drawing, it was a lottery drawing. And names are drawn. And this was how the PCs were going to end up together in the first place. This was sort of meant to be a first level adventure. and they were all going to have to get up on the pedestal, which started this scavenger hunt for this festival. And I was trying to, I found myself sticking too close to what the results from the rolls were supposed to be. In other words, I kept looking, going, okay, the scavenger hunt is an obstacle to the goal, and really it's just an extension of the trigger, so let me rethink that. So I ended up sort of scrapping that whole idea because I was overthinking the results and went with this sort of setup, and this is where I sort of ended up. I did keep that idea, though, that the drawing was a lottery drawing and not, and that will be my trigger here. So the basic setup is that the king's away at war, the queen's on a diplomatic mission, so the queen mother's kind of running things while they're gone. And there's this figurine that's been sort of locked in the lower depths of the castle, and it's missing, and there's no other clue to the disappearance other than the this black mark on the pedestal where it was kept. So there's the pedestal, there's the sort of trigger for this sort of mystery thing, because there's always got to be one clue left behind so Scooby-Doo and the gang can find it, right?
Right.
But here's the real problem. This statue is one of the 7 keys of Xylem. I love to put names on things. So it's one of the idol itself, one of the 7 keys of Xylem, and it's a set of statues that supposedly, when put together, will unlock this extra-dimensional gate, which brings this powerful being in from another dimension that will cause this destruction. Now, this is the part where Dave smiles, because Dave knows that I'm infamous for cults opening portals, bring Lovecraftian beasts through them, and so I did this really sort of like to poke at Dave, because he kind of pokes at me all the time for it. And so the reason this figurine was locked in the castle in the first place was just in case this was rumored to be true, that this wouldn't be an issue. But now with this statue missing, somebody obviously wants to put them together. So the Queen Mother asks the PCs to find the stolen key. She sort of, I think in here I accidentally ended up editing the part out where she chose them via a lottery drawing. So here are these people from this bank of heroes that have been trying to get the castle to hire them for these kinds of things. And so her task to them is to, if not find the stolen statue, at least find one of the other statues and bring it so that at least the same thing will be safe. And she hooks them up with a mystic who's going to help sort of divine the location of these statues. But the problem is he's a few ingredients short on the spell that are going to help him do that. So the scavenger hunt that triggers this whole thing is the scavenger hunt for the ingredients for the mystic spell, which will then sort of lead on.
Neat. Okay. So that really just shows to go that 3 very different takes on the same thing. So instead of 509, almost 600 trillion possibilities, really it's infinite, because we could probably come up with just the same random number seed is actually going to produce idea after idea after idea, depending on what you're thinking of, what you had for lunch that day, what movies or entertainment you saw, and like for example, drawing. I thought David and I just said, oh, physical drawing. You said, okay, lottery drawing. Maybe it's drawing a wire, like pulling it through a mandrel or something, right? So there's all kinds of meaning that you can imbue to these things. So moving on to the next one, because I did 3 of these, and just to see what could be done. So the next one came up with drawing again, which is interesting. Major goal was to locate or track down an NPC. Obstacle: clear name, restore honor in a citadel or keep. So we're back to the city. And you'll note that I'm going to refer. I only knew that these were all in the same place with the same king and queen and the same plot line after I'd come up with the ideas. But I'm going to present them as if it all came up as one giant campaign. Another statuary. So apparently we're all about the statues. And it's interesting because it's come up in 2 different ways, but it would make an interesting overarching theme to a series of adventures that they all have to do with some kind of sculpture. Anyway, shadows, domination, control, a candle, which is kind of fun, and a noble. And the noble is actually what led me to come up with the noble council. And so if you'll forgive me for, actually I'll leave this up. So there's a peasant, which is the key NPC, that saw someone get killed. A powerful noble was killed in the darkness. It was explained as an accident. A statue fell on him, shoved over by a different noble, who was naturally a friend of the king. The peasant saw it differently. The statue physically reached out to crush the dead noble's head, and only fell on him after it had been animated to do this deed. The culprit is another noble who used a magical candle that, instead of casting light, cast shadows. And the wizard, of course it's a wizard, gotta be a wizard, can control any stone that the shadow touches. Peasant saw all of that, but being smart, if poor, immediately went into hiding, because there's certain information that just gets you killed, and everybody knows it if you've got two neurons to rub together. So this person is gone. But you need the evidence to accuse a noble of a major crime. So the king suspects treachery. This is one move in a power play that will probably end in strife and regicide, because they always do. Kingdom changing hands, everything's at stake. But a scrap of the drawing, because of course, much like every movie that we've ever seen, the person who sees it has to make a picture of it. A scrap of this drawing has been found, but drawing isn't good enough. It has to be personal evidence, right? It's all about people and character and honor, and you can't have physical evidence. It's all about somebody's word, which tells you an awful lot about the legal system that has to underlie this world. And then before the usual court process can remove the king's friend, you have to find it, the evil noble, because he's got to be evil, or be really interesting if he weren't evil, and they, which just twist things. But the perpetrator has an army and magical abilities of his own, so he's a real threat. Can the PCs interdict and stop the plot in time? So that's where I went with that one.
Yeah, well, I was going to say the first one for me was the hardest, because I kept trying to turn it into a Dan Brown novel with the with the scavenger hunt, which tends to be a. But this one I too had a magical candle, and that's really what. Once I got that, that kind of drove my ideas. Mine was a candle, and the shadow that the candle cast, that shadow could like leave the person, almost like a out-of-body experience, and travel through the shadows to do bad things to other people's shadows, thereby killing the target. So you had this evil mage who was locked away in a tower, which gives us our Citadel Keep, and he was, when they locked him away, they cut out his tongue and smashed his hands, so he could no longer do the somatic and gestural components of the magic. Yeah, but somebody snuck him these magic candles, and so his shadow crept out to do vengeance on the people who locked him away, and so his shadow strangled the shadow, and thereby the persons who put him in this situation, and so you have to, your PCs are kind of left with trying to figure out how to avoid shadows. Like a street light is a bad place to be, but daytime's fine because there's not a lot of shadows. It has to be a clear shadow, right? If you have multiple light sources or very diffused lighting, you're pretty safe. So you kind of have this puzzle of how can you trap this shadow and keep it while you try and locate who it belongs to, or try and prevent an assassination of the head noble of the town, and that's pretty much where it went.
Richard,
are you ready for mine now?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, on this one, I actually had Dave take the email that you sent, change the order of the results, and add spaces between them. So when I got the email, I would have to scroll from item to item, so I would not be able to see them all at once. And I went through them in a different order than they were rolled or developed, because you sort of, because I wanted to see what the difference was in my natural way of doing it, which would be to sit down and sort of roll them one at a time and deal with each result as it popped up,
Sure.
rather than seeing the group at once as generated by a computer. So what I tended to do on this one was go through each item and think through it a little bit before I rolled the next one.
Got it.
So the thing that I started with was the location feature, which was the statuary. So that sort of drove my thematic wrapper, because that was the first thing I did. And what I came up with was I'm I'm not necessarily a Stan Lee fan, but I love the way he over-alliterates everything. So I had this Hall of 100 Heroes, just because I like the alliteration. And so as a statuary, it's this expansive gold-domed rotunda lined around its perimeter by 100 statues of the heroes of the realm. And these are guys, young, old, of every sort of race, shape, size, that have given their lives in the furtherance of freedom within the realm. So I went ahead at this point and decided, okay, since they're in a realm, I'm going to figure out what the shield, the heraldry crest, looks like. So I actually went to the heraldry tables in the Sandbox Companion, and what I ended up with was a roll of 28, 13, blah, blah, blah. But that's the graphic I put together today, and it's per pale indented division.
We can't see it.
Gray.
You will.
I think he's getting there. With a purple crosslet as the charge. So anyway, that's sort of because one of the things I love about, and I didn't come up with the name until later. So, but that's the shield for the heralded crest for the realm. So the next item in my list was the candle, and because I already had this statuary, to me the candle as an artifact sort of sits in the middle of this statuary, and I've called it the Flame of Undying Loyalty. And it's set on top of a large pedestal, and it's really a symbol for those heroes that have died near and far, and it's said to provide some sort of magical abilities to its possessor in terms of loyalty and strength in battle. That I sort of left a little open and ended up coming back to. The next thing that I came to was the villain or goal, and I went ahead and rolled him up first in the NPC tables in the book. And so my first roll was a natural 30, and for BX users that's going to be a reroll, but for original or first edition that's going to be rolling on the multi or split class table, and I went ahead and did that for interest's sake. And what I ended up with was this fairly high level fighter thief as the villain. So then the next thing that I had in my sort of order of list was the Citadel, and I've for a long time just had this sort of name, the Ebony Citadel, sort of sitting back there that I'll do something with at some point. So I just, for right now, just put the Ebony Citadel in and kept going. For the key NPC of a noble, I went ahead to the noble tables in the back of the book and rolled one up, and rolled up a Baroness who is just basically a friend of the family of the king. I went ahead and just gave her a name, and she's Baroness Inley Euthane. So that's her, where the Euthane comes from. So now we get to the trigger, a drawing. Now, just like in the first one, I didn't do the drawing like the first. I actually did this one first, which was one of the reasons in the other one I did a lottery drawing as opposed to a physical drawing, because in this one it's more of a physical drawing. And this is where it all took shape, because all these little pieces were sort of out there, and then this is where the whole thing sort of takes shape for me. So the Baroness, she's kind of known around the area as being a very good artist. And one night while she was sleeping, she had this dream. Now, it's all sort of written out in my sort of prosaic thing here, so I'll just kind of go through it. One night while she was sleeping, she had a dream of a man with such evil and darkness in his eyes that it shook her to her very soul. In this dream, the man entered the Hall of 100 Heroes and toppled every single statue to the ground, turning them all into piles of rubble. He then took the Flame of the Undying Loyalty and retreated to his citadel. a citadel of absolute blackness engulfed in flame. The next day, the Baroness awoke, shaken, but thinking nothing of her dream more than that, just a dream. Until the next day, when word reached her that, to where she is in the barony, that the Hall of Heroes had been vandalized and the flame had been stolen. And this is where I sort of wrote back in that the candle provides unquestioned loyalty from all those who serve its possessor, granting not only this dedication but other advantages in battle, including a host of magical abilities, to be determined.
Sure.
Vision as the only clue to the man's identity, advertisements have been circulated throughout the barony featuring her drawing of this man, with the offer of reward for anyone with information about them. So, the next thing that came to was revenge. I put it aside. I'll come back to it. Obstacle to goal: clear your name or honor. As your party walks through the streets of town, you notice the flyer. You also can't help but notice that the man on the flyer bears a striking resemblance to the fighter in your group. So, you basically, at this point, these people are looking at you. You know you look like this guy, but you also know you're not him. So you've got to either find out who this guy is, or your mistaken identity could lead to sort of dire consequences. And the backstory that has yet to be revealed to the players at this point is that this fighter thief, Norak the Hero Killer, that I've kind of called him, has more than once tried to claim a portion of the realm as his own, and his efforts were quashed time and time again by several of those who were actually honored in the hall as heroes. And though they died fighting Norak, their efforts helped continuing holding him at bay, and the toppling of the statues was simple payback. But the stealing of the candle is simple strategy, to raise an undyingly loyal army and take over the realm.
Interesting. Because, as you were talking, I will admit that you got 100 heroes. I would probably take that and say there are 100 baronies in the Kingdom of Youthane. There are 100 nobles. And the toppling of the statues represents the toppling of each barony, using your candle of loyalty to eventually take over the entire country. So even within one adventure seat, you've got room for interpretation.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the way that I went through that had a lot to do with where I ended up, I think.
It's really interesting, yeah. Lastly, just to complete it out, we've got the third adventure seed, where Doug has had far too much fun with fonts. Anyway, so trigger is an exotic item. The goal is to stop conflict, obstacle, find a hidden or lost entrance, forest, door, poisonings, mass destruction, cube, greed, and slave. Now, I will admit that the slave never really featured in what I was talking about, largely because I think I just started writing. But that's the whole point of this, is that you get an idea and then you run with it. So this one felt like money to me. There are unusual coins are being spread around. People who come in contact with these coins tend to die, falling victim to some sort of toxicity some days after they come in contact. It's part of the plot that had been discussed in the first two, a way to subvert, weaken, and destroy the king's hold on the land. A magical artifact. Let me see. I think I came back around to that. Anyway, there's a magical device that actually is responsible for making the land's coinage, but a piece has been removed. And without it, the money is tainted and bad for you. But it's an ancient device, and no one really knows how it works, who's still living, except this old noble. And so not every coin is toxic. It's kind of a random event. But those that are compel the possessor to spend them, spreading the disease like a vector. So the PCs have to venture to a special vault hidden deep in the enchanted forest to retrieve the piece or an otherwise unremarkable silver cube that looks a bit tarnished but detects strongly as magic. Naturally, the evil wizard has hidden the door. Or I say even better, maybe some other creature, perhaps a fae or some sort of spirit or a neutral party, stole the cube from the wizard. So the PCs still have to get it back. But maybe they have to even collaborate with this evil noble, because what you're really looking at is randomly the end of all things. Either the total stop of all commerce, which will kill the realm, or enough coins get made and tainted that everybody dies. In any case, bad news. And so there's time pressure, there's a bit of mystery, and there's maybe perhaps a hint of collaboration with the bad guy, because I've always wanted to see what happened when Han Solo and Princess Leia and those guys sat down to dinner with Darth Vader, and so that allows something like that. Just to tie it all together, all of these seem to revolve around the king and queen of a particular land, so they could be linked. Same noble, instant big bad evil guy, just add hate, and you get an opportunity for a party of murder hobos to come to the attention of royal family, and thus being enmeshed in all of this political stuff. And if it's over their head, if all that politics is over their head, even better, but these guys become sort of special agents for the royal family, and thus you can sort of explain why they're involved in one freaking thing after another, like Bruce Willis's character in Die Hard. Why does this keep happening to me? Next.
Oh, well, yeah, but before you go on, but why does it keep happening to me, and why do I have to sit down and have dinner with Hans and get involved with him? This kind of like, anyway, I won't respond. I'll come back to yours. I'll just let Dave go.
Okay.
Yeah. So this one was more of a. You've got two crime syndicates in the town going at it because one of them was poisoned, and there was one of the family's sort of regional treasures or weaponry found at the crime scene of this assassination inside the houses of one of the crime syndicate families. And long story short, to spoiler, it was a slave inside the house who had wound up escaping, and through an old escape tunnel that led out to a forest through a hidden door, and so these guys are gonna maybe the PCs work for one of the crime families or associated with it or do dealings with it, but they have to sort of stop this conflict that was started by the slave, sort of as revenge for all the bad things that crime families do, and it's pretty much where it went.
Okay, Richard.
When I was looking at the list of sort of results, I actually have there's an adventure I'm working on in the back of my mind right now put together, and I actually ended up tying it into that and sort of making it part of that thing. So when I reference this Fair Shadow Valley here in a second as this location, it's actually part of a map that I posted on the blog a while back and said, here's this map I worked up, and so with the intention of sort of working on it sort of generically over time and seeing what happens. So that's the location for this thing rather than, sort of the overreaching campaign that you've put together. It's more a piece of this other overreaching campaign that I've actually been putting together. A major pass into the north end of Fair Shadow Valley is controlled by goblins who are attacking everyone who passes through. If the dwarves and the elves who were encamped in the forest just north of that side of the valley, outside the entrance, if they would join forces, the goblins would be easily dispensed, but a misunderstanding between the dwarf and elf leaders has them bickering instead of dispensing. The dwarves have come in search of a place rumored to be laden with treasure. The quote-unquote key to this door that supposedly hides this treasure is a small metal cube about 3 inches aside, ornately engraved with an array of dwarven runes, which slides into a space on the door to allow entry. That's how the story goes. And the dwarves had the key, which now seems to be missing. And the dwarves blame the elves for the theft. Well, the elves need to secure passage through the valley so they can bring medicine to towns on the other side where there are people suffering from these mass poisonings. And given the greed of the goblins, it's most likely that they've stolen the cube. And taking the goblins head-on is kind of foolhardy. And if the PCs could, say, find a back entrance, that's ultimately what they're looking for. So the sort of thing that happens is there's this goblin slave that escapes his goblin masters, and he's sneaking out of a back entrance sort of just in time for the PCs to sort of see this kind of thing. So, it's a little coincidental, but it's, workable, I suppose. So inside the PCs, inside the compound, the PCs will eventually find the cube. The door is in there too, in a different part. And the dwarves know these go together. The PCs know they go together. The goblins obviously didn't figure that out. And they'll find evidence that the goblins are being backed by a as yet to be determined person who's responsible for the poisonings, and he's paying these greedy goblins pretty well just to keep people out of the valley, especially these elves. I went back and forth on what this exotic item should be for the trigger, and at one point it was an herb that was the medicinal herb the elves were bringing in for the poisons. And,
okay, interesting.
And then I thought, well, the cube is kind of the exotic item, but I think I may have edited accidentally out the herbs.
On the flip side, though, there's no reason why there can't be several exotic items.
No, exactly.
So, yeah, okay, cool. So, I mean, I hope that anyone who's watching is still watching. We spent a long time on those 3 adventure seeds, but at least if my blog traffic is any indication, there's going to be 4 people who actually watch this, and everybody else will read it. So hopefully people will bear with us as we go through these ideas. But overall, I think it's really interesting, right? We had 3 random rolls, at least 10 different ideas out of those 3 rolls times 3 people, and it's just, what am I going to do for tomorrow's adventure? I'm going to roll some dice and have a great idea, which leads me into sort of a different kind of question. Do you see a future of any sort for something like, right now it's OSR, which is Dungeon, but do you see an expansion for this for a D30 action movie or a D30 special ops sandbox generator, the expanded daily terrorist activity table, or the Jack Bauer kneecap damage table or something? Science fiction, you could have a science fiction scenario generator. What do you think about the market or the work involved? I mean, toddlers aside, it sounded like it took a long time to come up with these kind of tables. I would probably wind up with the Disney princess superhero alien table because my daughter will freely combine such. Pretty soon it's going to be like the, Ariel is going to ride in to fight Lex Luthor on an ogre. Like, no, I mean Steve Jackson ogre, not an ogre Shrek ogre, because so it's inspiration comes from a lot of places. So what do you think beyond the old school Dungeon and Dragons or fantasy stuff? Do you think that there's more out there, because it's of wonderful utility to have this kind of idea generator, and you've got a lot more genres that are out there.
Dave and I have talked about that a little bit, because strangely enough, when we sort of were putting the Sandbox Companion to bed, and I say that like a month before it was released, as we sort of got all the tables together, and at that point it just became proofing and writing the introduction, we sort of felt like we had completed the fantasy sort of thing, that there wasn't much left there in terms of big picture, quick needs. And maybe there's some details that aren't there yet, but there's nothing sort of bigger and more sort of daily important that really absolutely should be in there. And the next question, should we do something outside of that realm in sort of a different place? And my initial reaction is there is very little I would know well enough to do a good job of it. Because this is one of those things that I'm familiar with, that I've got a good handle on, and the only other thing for me that would come close, that I would sort of consider, would be a Mutant Future style, Gamma World-ish, Thundar the Barbarian-ish, sort of Aftermath-ish. Dave's a big fan of what's the
Moral Project.
Moral Project. And it's sort of a little bit too it's a little more serious than something like Gamma World, where you have you could have bunny ears and extra arms and things. But I would feel more comfortable doing something like that. But it does take a big time commitment to do it. And because what happened with the Sandbox Companion is it really developed 1 week at a time as I was putting stuff out to the blog. And right now that my interest is in that place, still in that sort of fantasy place, So unless it takes me, and I won't say it won't, because I'm severely ADD when it comes to the kind of projects I work on, or the number of projects I work on. They're all tend to be a lot of the same style of thing. That it would just sort of have to happen and take a hold to be passionate about it, because it's if I'm not passionate about it, I can't be convinced I do a good job of it. If that makes sense.
That's sort of a theme in creativity, right?
Yeah, it is, and it's sort of like, I mentioned this Valley of the Five Fires, Mongolian-inspired setting, and it was triggered because a guy I know through the that has this other blog, the Ramblings of a Great Khan, William Dowie, was going to do a single-page Mongolian-themed adventure contest. It may not have been single page, but it was an adventure-themed, Mongolian-themed adventure contest. And I started developing new monsters, putting maps together, and then it overgrew from what was supposed to be a little, like, 2 or 3 day knock it out for a contest kind of thing, because the passion got a hold of me.
Right, it just snowballed, right.
Yeah, and so if one of those other things happens, it will be because it snowballs, but because I'm already sort of passionate about it anyway. And Dave and I collectively probably have enough anime background to pull off something like that.
Right.
But that would be it. I'm not an action, like the sort of Jack Bauer kind of thing you mentioned earlier. I'm not much for the espionage and or suspense thriller stuff. I've never been a blow-up helicopters movie kind of guy. And so it would be hard to get behind that without sort of...
You are now dead to me.
My brother's passion for that should more than make up for mine.
Fair enough. And it's funny though, because there's a blog. It's a new blog, and I'm going to forget the name of it, and I really shouldn't. But I think I call him Mr. Insidious. I think it's called Insidious GURPS Planning, but he's running a really interesting, intricate espionage campaign. And to come up with these interleaved conspiracies is a challenge. And next week I'm interviewing Ken Haidt, and he actually has for Night's Black Agents a conspiracy generator. I've ordered the book. I'm going to read it. But that just has to be awesome, because one of the hardest things to do, I think, is to come up with enough layers so that it's not just, okay, there's a bad guy, I shoot him in the head. Well, okay, then I guess the plot's over and it's time to start a new game. But that's the kind of thing where if you could come up with a scenario and weave it in such that you could find an overarching theme, it would be, again, time saver. Something that doesn't require quite as much thought. And I don't want to make it sound as if, we're all a bunch of clods out here who don't want to think. But, as David, I'm sure that with twins, you just run out of time.
Yeah.
You just run out of time. And if you want to get a bunch of people together of like minds and of like age, I used to be able to get 15 and 20 people together to game, and that was in college. And actually, I was working... But I was in a martial arts group that had a lot of college students in it. I would say, we're going to do a GURPS game. I did some Dungeon Fantasy type stuff, and I did a Firefly campaign, and I could get 6 to 10. I had once like 18 people around the table. But that was because most of these guys had a lot of free time, even though they wouldn't admit it. But now that we're adult, we know what free time really looks like. And so you could do that sort of thing, but coming up with a campaign, you just put in 40 to 80 hours of real work, so to speak, and you're home, you're like, oh, I have a game tomorrow that I haven't been able to work on. What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to hit F9, damn it, and here's a scenario, and then I write it up, and I can generate some NPCs, and you just go from there, because it's usually the activation energy, if I can borrow a dork phrase, to get over the hump, to get the idea rolling, and then all of a sudden, oh, I'm inspired and I can go. That's where I think the Sandbox Companion and Sandbox clones for different genres has so much power.
Right. Well, in one of the things that Richard passed his time doing prior to getting into the OSR thing was periodically trying to write screenplays, and so the adventure generator I see as is coming directly out of that experience and expertise in understanding story arcs and sort of how to create a heroic plot and everything that needs to go in there to be a satisfying experience and story.
And that's really interesting because it almost seems like, especially for someone with experience in writing plays or screenplays or plays or scripting novels, you could almost say, like, you know, you have a D30 table that would be kind of the object of the adventure, and you have a plot twist table, you know, betrayal, complication, other player, you know, other faction. I mean, you could really see how you could have a series of 5 to 10 roles that would lay out almost a trilogy of an idea. Here's the first act, here's the second act, and of course something has to go horribly wrong for the heroes in true Empire Strikes Back fashion, and here's the resolution. Is interesting.
Well, the thing about screenplays, though, and this is why sometimes the espionage genre sort of overwhelms me. In terms of the conspiracy thing that you were talking about, it's why I can sit and, not to say I can't sit all day and do a Bourne Ultimatum, a Bourne trilogy marathon. It actually, the ability to sort of weave that escapes me, because from a storytelling point of view, it's almost like you have to know where it ends, and then you have to back it up, because if everything that happens in the course of a really great story is about conflict or being sidetracked from your original goal, because that's really, if you look at sort of any kind of great story arc, what happens is the person sets out thinking they want one thing and finding out it's something else, but being sidetracked the entire time until they come to that realization. Well, the thing with really great mysteries and espionage and those sorts of things, or the conspiracy sort of stories, you almost have to start from the end and work your way back, and then figure out how to weave them back. And in an RPG, that seems... well,
you aren't in control of the story.
Yeah, it's very...
Right?
Yeah, I agree.
It's a collaborative storytelling genre.
Right. As a writer, you can say, oh, and here's where the plot twists occur, and this is what all 7 primary characters, or 9 or 10 if you're Joss Whedon, this is where they all go with that, and I'm going to dictate that, and it works. And if you're Joss Whedon, you're J. Michael Straczynski, you pull it off, and it's beautiful and wonderful, and unless your show gets canceled after 14 episodes, you're good. Whereas in a role-playing game, if the players decide that no, they're just not interested in chasing after the Valley of the Lost Troglodyte, you're done, and you need to find something else to do. And the players will deeply resent any attempt to get them back into the frickin' valley.
Yeah, Dave and I had the opportunity. No, I'm sorry. Dave was in this game, but he had a chance to watch me. I played in Michael Curtis's game of. He was playtesting his new. Michael Curtis did the Dungeon Alphabet and Stonehell Dungeon and everything. Michael, he writes a lot of DCC modules. Michael's been working on a new game called Shiverwind. That's sort of, if you go to the Shiverwind blog, you'll kind of get a better feel than I could sort of try to describe it here. But
I'll link to it so people can follow that. Yeah.
I had a chance to play in his one of his test games at the North Texas RPG Con last year. And as a group of players, we were much too cagey about our very first interview. It's kind of like it's got some conspiracy elements, but it's set in more almost like a sort of retro apocalypse sort of thing. So it's kind of Depression era feeling, and we come to this first the first encounter. The first sort of encounter gets us really off the bat and right into the story, and then there's this sort of interview period right afterwards. We played it too cagey, and I think we spent 30 minutes sort of cagily doing this interview when we really should have just asked the guy a question and gone to the other side of the city. And that's where the sort of the best constructed conspiracy plot can be side railed by players who really don't know where to take it.
Right.
And so Michael handled it fine for what needed to happen. But it's one of those things where those things are difficult for me. It's one of the reasons I sort of love sort of trap dungeons and that sort of traditional dungeon crawl thing is because I love little bits that are self-contained that require you to pass them to get to that, require you to unlock the key to get to the next step. And it's easier to deal with in those chunks because that's what the adventure generator is. It's little chunks of information, and you weave it how you need to weave it. And it's one of the things that I think in my screenplay writing that always fell apart for me was continuing to bring it to that point at the end and making it fulfilling.
Sure.
The bits are great, and I know where to take it if there's people involved, but you might feel the resolution's a bit flat if I just drag you along.
Right. So, but I do have to ask one question. So you sort of passed on screenplays for movies. You decided to not do the rock and roll thing, and you settled on role-playing game publishing. How can we really trust judgment like that? Sorry, it was just funny. I just thought it was funny.
It's one of those things. It goes back a little bit to my ADD thing. I was really, as a screenwriting thing, it was getting better at it, entering contests, getting some response from that. And I got to the point where I was ready to start sort of putting things out there, but I was actually doing fairly well and getting to the final stage in some of the competitions. But I've also done short films on my own in the past, and there is nothing I hate more than not being in control of what that product is. And all of a sudden I realized that my goal had always been as screenwriting to be able to make my own movie as a director as well.
And that is in fact a Super 8 camera right behind you, is it not?
It is. It's that's one I've never used, but it is a Super 8 camera. So there's some film and video stuff in all corners of this room, actually. And so I'd made a few short films, and the process works best when everybody else stays out of my way, in terms of the filmmaking, and it's why I prefer to edit my own stuff when I make short films, and in some cases I've even scored my own stuff. And I was what was starting to wear me out on the screenwriting was the amount of investment it takes to really polish this one thing. It's why I've never been interested in novels either. And just to have somebody go, we don't think there's a plot here, or it's a very subjective thing, and you were so separated from the people who were judging it. And with the music, I had, before Dave and I were working together, I'd played in a local band here in the Dallas area, and we were starting to get some response, but again, I sort of fell victim of the fact that the problem with the band that I was in at the time was there were other guys in it. That's sort of the problem. And so when the guitar player accuses the drummer of outing his affair, behind his girlfriend's back with another girl, and he blames the drummer when it's really him that's the issue, and then the band falls apart because these guys' personal lives is just a pile. It was the filmmaking, the screenwriting, it was always sort of relying on too many other people to make it fulfilling.
And yet, you could have probably turned that into a reality show.
You know what? We probably funnily enough, strangely enough, okay, so this is a complete unrelated RPG story since you've mentioned reality shows, and I knew Dave was afraid of this happening at some point. The guitar player in the band applied for The Bachelor one season, or The Bachelorette. He was applying to be one of the suitors on The Bachelorette.
Ah, very good, very good.
And he made the interview cutoff. But one of the questions on the questionnaire is, do you have any children? He outrightly lied because he had a kid outside of a marriage, because he'd never been married. And he just no. And so I think they even flew him out to do the original interviews while the background check was being done on him. And this is the guy who, anyway.
Anyway, so see, that would be called the cliffhanger, because you're not going to tell the end of the story.
He got out. He got booted before he even got on the show. So that's the end of that thing. But the egos involved with that are just too much. And so what was nice about getting back into the gaming thing and doing the publishing side of this is it started through the blog, and the response is immediate. You know how many people are coming to see it every day. You know how many, and because I do all of my free downloads through MediaFire, I can track how many people have downloaded them. And I'd almost rather know that, in this case, the Sandbox Companion, I'd rather know that a few hundred people have downloaded it and that 8 people have given it 5-star ratings than to have done a movie where I would have no idea if the millions of people liked it or not. You know what I mean? And so it's the immediacy of that. You know that if you're at a table with these guys and it's working, you know it's working.
Right.
And that, so it's still getting the chance to sort of go through that creative experience, but to get that immediate reaction, because even with short films or even playing in a band, you've got to practice and go out. The gaming thing is almost immediate. You kind of get your basic thoughts together and you put it out there on the table and it happens or it doesn't.
But it's really interesting because, of course, you have it right. It is creative, but it's also collaborative, and it's hard. I mean, and part of it is that you really do need to balance between a totally open, and this is where the sandbox thing really starts, I think, share, is it's open, but it's only open from day to day because it's a bit random and the players can do what they want. But also you do get some sort of control. I want to, we've been chatting for a while, I've been having great fun, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the sandbox and also what's coming next for New Big Dragon Games. A couple things, I guess, 2 specific things and then more a broad piece. The prevailing weather section is really interesting. Do you think that that's something that the GM is going to do every day? Is that something where there's always rolling dice to see what's going on, or how does that work? Because, like one of my friends, Peter Dell'Orto, looks out the window and says, oh, it's really freaking cold today. It's 4 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind is blowing and it's never going to change until May because it's Minnesota. And it makes me long to be back in Irving, Texas. So how do you guys envision that working?
I think we talked about this, I think, during the development, and honestly, I see it being used the way as everything else in the entire book, differently by every person that has it. Because I could see if I've got my players in a tropical rainforest, hell yeah, I'm going to roll that thing every day. But if we're in a temperate zone, I can look out the window and say, it's nice, it's windy, but move on.
Right. It's Los Angeles, sunny 72, sunny 72, sunny 72. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think it's one of those things where you're not going to use it all the time, but there are going to be times where you probably use it in a little kind of window, and then it goes away again. The same as the foraging hunting thing. It's sort of like you're really not forced to use that until everybody, until the GM sort of looks at everybody's sheets and go, what, these guys have been out of rations for 2 weeks and I haven't said anything. I'm going to make them go hunting and foraging just to see what happens.
And that's interesting, I think, because the thing about hunting and foraging and the survival part of these overland journeys that are so inherent to sandbox campaigns or old school, hex crawls or GURPS Dungeon Fantasy, if you're not actually in dungeon going from place to place, the ration bit is important unless you've got basically something like Peter's Fell Tower campaign where you always start in town and you always end in town. I think he's got one session of like 38 or some crazy number where they haven't done the adventure and come back to town. That's the whole point. I think he doesn't even give you experience unless you get your loot back to town. And the thing is, with what I liked about it is, first of all, your tables are really interesting. And the thing that struck me about them is you do your dice rolling, and the way you can leave it is you are now within 30 yards or feet or whatever your unit is of a game animal. What do you do? It almost sets up the situation. Oh, look, you've come across a deer or a wild boar or a dire badger or whatever, and then you get to deal with it. Do you actually successfully hunt or not? And the other thing, and this ties into something else, is that I estimated that 80-85% of this book is entirely generic regardless of system, as long as you're more or less doing a wilderness fantasy campaign. Mm-hmm. Was that deliberate or just a byproduct of the fact that plotting a plot line is generic?
I think the latter. I think it just sort of happened naturally because I was thinking about, okay, what fills in these stories? What am I going to need to use? What am I using? And oddly enough, the table in the book that I've probably used more than any of the others is the chart that determines which kind of suppliers and vendors are in the town based on the size of the town. Because you sort of can always just say, oh, it's got this, this, and this, but if you're out of arrows, there's a big deal of whether or not there's a Fletcher, in the town. So that's the one I've come back to a lot. I also use the NPC ones a lot because that tends to be what I need to generate. What's here when these guys stop? But yeah, it's sort of just, it wasn't intentional. I think it just sort of happened. I think if it had been, which is completely opposite of what the DM companion is. If you
okay. I don't have the DM companion, so
yeah, I'll try to copy them. It is much more system dependent, if you will.
Okay.
Because there's a good 6 pages throughout 3 full spreads in the book that are nothing but sort of classic dungeon monster stats in the sort of, I don't know if you're familiar with the old Monster Treasure assortment from TSR that was put out sort of between first edition and original edition and their first, the Holmes Blue. Because the monster stats in it are in a weird mix because there's monsters in there that you'll see that end up in the Moldvay Red Book only, and then there's other descriptions that are only obviously in the first edition monster manual, but they're all written in such a way to sort of be generic between those original 3 systems. And so the monster stats in DM Companion are written up in that way. So if you're doing Swords and Wizardry or Labyrinth Lord, it really doesn't matter. You can sort of take them and run with them, and it sort of acts as a sort of compact monster manual stat block.
Sure.
And there's a lot of that because there's DM, there's a lot of it is generic. Here's mold, slimes, mushrooms, this kind of stuff. And about half of it is, but then you've got this complete list of monsters and the stats that go with them and all these encounter tables that are very much system dependent.
Treasure types.
Right.
Treasure types as well. And even with that treasure type set of tables in the first book, it really speeds up the treasure type rolls, but it also says, hey, if you're using this system, you need to use this table instead because it's a bit of a conversion issue.
Right.
Where the Sandbox thing, I think it's more generic because it just sort of happened. It's really about, you're right, it's what you said, it's what Dave said, it's really about story and who are these people and these personalities, and it's creating the flavor. It's really a book of flavor.
Right. Because so I want to, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like the tables of NPC personalities and things that are in there and backgrounds and descriptions. You're right, that's generic to almost anything. You could sort of just pick those up and put them in almost any other kind of game. It doesn't have to be fantasy to know. There's what I don't remember what we ended up with changing it to, but for the longest time there was a personality quirk in the NPC tables that was listed as talks out of his ass.
Yeah, we kept it.
Oh, we did keep it because we couldn't find anything that did justice to that sort of personality, and it doesn't matter if you're playing in a Star Wars campaign or in a fantasy sort of campaign. If you meet a guy who talks out of his ass, he's going to talk out of his ass,
and he will be memorable for it.
Exactly.
So I want to tie a couple of things together. Let's see if I can do my old consulting thing and be thematically complete here. So we have Sandbox. We have a lot of tables. We have spontaneity. We have lack of time. So at what point, if ever, do you sit down and say anything that can be made tabular can be computerized? And where, if at all, do you say instead of publishing 56 pages of this, we're going to come up with an application that allows, because what you don't want to do, I think, is sit down and say, oh, you come to a village, you guys go get pizza, because by the time you get back from 30 minutes, I'll finish rolling dice and making notes about the village that you find. Better, I think, to say, give me a village, and it's like the Excel thing that I did, which is how I would implement your book. A lot of VLOOKUP, but I could easily see doing something crazy, like take a fractal terrains map, use your tables to populate it hex by hex, and kind of, hey, instant world, just have a couple of clock cycles on a reasonably You wouldn't even need a powerful computer to do this kind of thing, because honestly, what we're doing, a random number generator and a lookup and some inspiration seeds, is not that hard from a computation standpoint. Do you see taking advantage of the modern digital computational medium to take this kind of game master aid one step farther?
I'm sort of torn on that, because I love paper, and I will read books on my iPad, but prefer to have physical copies. But at the same time, if I were to want to do something like that, or we were going to do something like that, I would rather see it be an app for a device rather than a computer thing or a website. Because there are plenty of websites where, depending on what your interest is in terms of your game genre, where you can just go, okay, create a town, or there's the dungeon where, well, not only will it generate the dungeon, it'll fill in the rooms and tell you what the traps are and the magic items and monsters. And hell, at the click of a button and you've got it on your screen, you can walk the guys through it. And there's several things that are similar that will generate tavern towns and personality types. And some of those are out there in those different places. And what you're really talking about is putting them all in one place, so it's kind of like a master sort of sandbox. This is, to me, what the only advantage of doing something like that would be. Maybe. It's not anything that's on the top of our radar right now, but I don't necessarily think it's anything we rule out. It's just not where our heads are at.
Yeah, we're kind of deep into the old school vibe at this point, and sort of paper and books and those sort of supplements are where it's at, and rolling dice is metal. So that's
Yeah,
kind of.
When he says metal, he means like metal, that kind of way metal.
So yeah, that's kind of where we're at with that. And the D30 Sandbox Companion was never intended to be a world generator. It typically, as a GM, you probably have your campaign in your world, and it's sort of you have that in your head, and the day that the players decide to go one place instead of the place you've predicted, or go on just a huge tangent, well, you kind of need to give them something, and the D30 Sandbox is there to make that worthwhile.
And a piece of jerky to gnaw on until you can come up with a new plot
and
scene.
Rich enough, and hopefully it gives it enough structure and framework that you as the DM can use all those ideas but it gives you enough space so that you as a DM can put in the things that you need to allow to get the characters maybe back on track, or give them nudges in a different way than you had planned originally.
Yeah, I think there's something about that resonates with me. I teach a couple of graphic design classes at a local college, and one of the things I've noticed happening, especially more over the last 7 or 8 years, is that my students who have come to the class with it used to be that we worked on paper and boards when I first started teaching this 13, 14 years ago, before everybody had computers and before there were big labs at the campus where everybody could get to all the time. And I have found that since the students are more computer aware, they tend to do things, this is the way they tend to lay things out. They put a block down where the headline goes, and they put a block down where the photo goes, and then they just sort of push them around the page. And what I like about the DM Companion as an item, like, I don't even really like using the PDF version, even though it's complete, click on the tables and the table of contents takes you where to go. I like the physical copy because it is a little bit more nebulous in the way I interact with it. And the thing about what you're suggesting is it does solve that issue of I need to populate or fill this in very quickly.
Right, it's instant gratification instead of let me sit down offline with this and then plot out what's going on.
But if that's the case, then what you're doing is you're going exactly to some place it's spitting that result back out immediately for you and taking the process out of, taking that interaction out of the process. And if that's what you're looking for, I think that's workable. I think that's something that can benefit a lot of people. It's not the way I tend to interact with it.
Sure.
And so because of that, I think it's the reason that neither of us is, like, right now has that in our scopes or on our radar in terms of doing that sort of app, because it's, it's not that, I don't think we're trying to sort of be those independent musician guys who say, no, I never want a record deal, I'm never going to sell out, I'm never digital. It's really kind of not that. I think it's just that because we don't approach it from that point of view and haven't found ourselves needing it that way, that we don't we don't think of it as a thing that needs to be done.
But that doesn't mean that technology didn't play any part in the creation of what we did here, especially with the D30 DM Companion. I had a program that I wrote that to help create some of the dice curves to when we tried to use the D30 to emulate the probability space of, say, 3D6 or 4D, what was it, 44 and all this other stuff.
We actually, in the DM Companion, there are bell curve tables that emulate all of the different first edition number
encounters, sure.
Encounters. And so it's everything from a 2D4 to a 3D6 to a 48, kind of crazy combinations of numbers.
Mm-hmm.
And but yeah, like he was saying, he wrote a program to help develop those probability curves. Well, and then I'm a layout guy, so I tend to love layout, and something about the interaction, the functionality of that sort of point and click thing takes that fun away of having it all sort of here in front of you as a display.
And I guess I'm kind of either one or the other. I do like the visceral feel of books, and when I read, I do have a Kindle, and I prefer the Kindle to a active display tablet because it's more like paper. Mm-hmm. But I can have an entire library that comes with me. And actually, I don't use the tiny Kindle. I use the DX largely because I can actually read my PDF files, my GURPS PDF files on this without a magnifying glass.
Do you have the D30?
I have not yet imported it onto the Kindle, but I do have it on my computer screen, and largely because I do my creation of content on my computer, because I find both a tablet and a Kindle unsatisfying for that. I'm very mathematical, and so I need Excel. I almost, like, if I'm reading a Stephen King novel or if I'm reading, Robert Ludlum, I need Excel. I don't know why, but I do.
I thought it would be. This is a good point to try and plug the fact that in the PDF version we did take and put forward a lot of effort to make sure that it was an active PDF with clickable links to and from cross-page references and all that, because we knew that a lot of DMs are bringing their tablets and Kindle type things, devices to the gaming table, as opposed to the paper.
And honestly, that is one of the things that I talked about a little bit in this interview. Clearly, I did it with the F9. I can get access to 590 trillion adventure seeds by pushing F9 over and over again. And really what that is because of the layout choices that you guys made, it was easy for me to highlight the tables and paste them into Excel, and I don't have to do crazy formatting. It was literally paste, 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 and here it is. And I could do the same with weather. I could do the same with hunting. I could link the hunting to a creature generator. I could link several of the different pieces of a town together, so it's like, instant town add F9. So I mean, the utility there, and this is part of the 85-90% generic, 95 to 100% if you work at it a little bit, is why I think it's so compelling, why Eric continues to rave about it, and where it would get great utility. So just to kind of wrap things up, although by wrapping it up, what I'm going to do is hand you guys the wheel again. What's next for New Big Dragon?
I've always got more going on than I will let on. So there's stuff that Dave doesn't even know, like, for example, I've got happening. And then I'll show up one day and hand him like 80 pages and go, here, look at this. That's when he knows he's in trouble. And but immediately there's sort of two things sort of, I think, right in front of us right now. The first is we're working on, I mentioned earlier the Valley of Five Fires module, which is this Mongolian-inspired setting. I was sort of inspired to take the setting and wrap it into a sort of task force style war game. You know, sort of the old, it's in the old small envelope, kind of like when Steve Jackson first put out Car Wars and Ogre and everything. They were like little pocket box games, very sort of similar format, in a more traditional sort of move the chits around the table kind of war game. And we're in the process of sort of testing that for playability right now, because there's this really great backstory in the Valley of Five Fires that tells itself quickly in a war game, which was a nice sort of thing. We started play testing around New Year's Day, I think, was our first physical play test at the table, and went pretty well. We're just sort of working some mechanics out, and that's another one of those complete OSR vanity projects that if only 10 people ever buy it, I'll be happy, because those guys are in love with that format as I am, and they'll be happy to have something new to add to that collection. The other thing, I mentioned earlier that I love sort of puzzle-style dungeons. Starting last year for the A to Z blogging challenge in April, I did a blog a day that was an additional room of this themed dungeon, and sort of we've been refining it and sort of playing through it some, and just getting a group together to sort of give a good final playtest run on what's there. And I sort of like to think of it as a sort of first level version of Tomb of Horrors, if you will, because it's sort of like prevent some of those challenges, and you can easily die in the first room if you're not.
The Crypt of Mildly Eerie.
Well, it's actually very innocent. It's not nearly as sort of like creepy as like the Tomb of Horrors or anything like that. You're not going to face this Demi Lich at the end or anything, but it's still got a lot of those sort of like little, it's challenges room after room that you've got to kind of make your way through, and it's going to require a lot of player handout sheets, and it's again sort of in that OSR style where here's the module and here's the separate illustration book so you can show your players at the table, and would love to have it tested enough with the group that we're about to start that we could release it by North Texas RPG Con. Not likely, but would love for that to happen. So, and then other stuff. There's always something going on in the background. Dave probably can think of other things that I'm not forgetting to talk about right now. I know he's always got something.
Geomorphs.
Oh yeah, we need to get back on the community Geomorph project that I'd started, and I collected a lot of Geomorphs. I was redrawing them so they were all in one style, and ultimately the goal is to benefit the Crohn's Colitis Foundation. Because I think it's Dave's Mapper that sort of started that, and that was the goal. But I got sidetracked with finishing up the Sandbox Companion, and now that's sort of put away, that's really where my sort of blog and OSR immediate attention needs to go when we're not playing stuff.
So actually, I lied. I'm going to take control back just for a sec, because you brought up something that's interesting, I think. Speaking for myself, not as a content creator necessarily, I'm not an employee of Siege Action Games, but I do a lot of work around the system because I like it. It's very difficult. I think there's one recent, maybe two recent adventures for GURPS. Mirrors of the Fire Demon by Matt Rigsby. And there's some things that have appeared in Pyramid. You just talked a couple of times about various adventures and modules. Are those labors of love? Are those something you do because you like them and they sell 10 copies and you'd never recoup the money? Or is there a market there in the OSR module because it's fairly self-contained that isn't going to exist for a generic game? It's a point of great contention. If you want to start a fight on the Steve Jackson Games forum, bring up adventures. and you'll get the same people. It's great. You want people to think, oh, there need to be adventures for GURPS, and it would be so great. But unless you give me this, and this, I'm not going to buy it. Which kind of, and everyone has a different list of this, and this. So it very rapidly becomes, I think, a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in y'all's experience, you've just tossed out a couple different ideas for modules or adventures or whatever. How do you look at that?
Honestly, those tend to be more. Everything is really a labor of love because we never expect things to do super great. The nice thing about it, it was John Stater that did Blood and Treasure and some other stuff. He's a big OSR guy as well. He recently blogged about he just wants to make enough back to sort of cover the cost of putting them together in the first place. And because, in the old sort of days where things were put together on copy machines and stapled and sent out, which is, a lot of guys are putting these zines together and things like that now, that was kind of really the point. It's like, hey, we're doing this. We just kind of want to share it with you. The blog gives us the ability to sort of do that for free. And like Valley of the Five Fires was absolutely a passion project. And it's one of those things where it's such a unique setting that I knew before it was out, it would not be one of those things that people just like clamored to. But the D30 DM Companion was a passion project, and people responded to it, but not nearly in the way they have with the D30 Sandbox Companion. And the DM Companion was like good response, and people were speaking of it, and it did what I really wanted it to do, for example, which was have a better source than Judges Guild old Ready Ref sheets and the TSR old Monster and Treasure assortment. It was sort of like a much better, more flexible version of that. And that was the goal for the Sandbox Companion. We have the huge benefit of the fact that I do all the drawings myself unless I'm using public domain clip art, and I do all the layout myself. Everything is done via PDF or print on demand, so there is next to nothing as far as out-of-pocket costs goes. So if money is made, it's profit. But if you look at it and say, okay, my day job, this is what I like to charge an hour for my graphic design services, we don't make nearly that back.
Right. So let me
hours that go in, but there's essentially no overhead for me as opposed to guys like John Stater who have to buy art for his work. I don't have to do that.
Sure. So let me ask you a quick question. Order of magnitude, and feel free to say none of your business. 10, 100,000, 10,000, 100,000. D30 Sandbox Companion, 3 weeks on the bestseller list. What order of magnitude is that? And feel free to tell me to take a flying leap because those are usually tightly held. But
still a small publisher thing. I think people will be surprised by how few copies a day you have to sell to stay at the top of that list.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at is when you're looking at a going concern for a business as opposed to I just want to make enough money to recoup losses and interest me in the next project. I think you're talking two different pools or two different risk profiles for if you were an investor or looking to make your livelihood at this as opposed to I just want to make it so that I can do another one and not feel stupid about it.
When we did the DM Companion, we made enough to cover our costs for last year's North Texas RPG Con, and we both live here. We didn't even really stay in the hotel. We sort of drove, except for one night in the hotel. But it paid for our meals, it paid for our passes, it paid for some other expenses while we were there, and that was nice. I think that was our goal with the Sandbox Companion, and we've done a little bit more than that. It's been nice to have that, but it's given us some room. Our intention was always to take anything we made and put it back into other stuff. It was never to sort of like take the profit and start to become a huge company.
Right, buy a Matchbox Mercedes or something, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so with like, for example, we mentioned this little Valley of the Five Fires sort of small war game kind of thing with little cardboard chits and everything. If the game is good enough that we feel it deserves to be a full box with tokens and cards, which it has the potential to be, I think, because it would actually simplify the play to have all the encounters on cards that you pull from a deck rather than referring to the small rule book constantly. It may be worth doing as a Kickstarter, for example. We will try to never have to go to Kickstarter, because I think our preference would be, let's get the prototype together, but that's a big risk to say, let's put together something that needs to be on the shelf at game stores across the country.
Sure.
And it's a different model, and I don't know that we're ready to step to that yet, because this even with that response and 3 weeks at the top of the RPGNow charts is one thing, but going to the annual toy fair, to connect with retailers across the country is another, and it's sort of one step at a time.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dave, go ahead.
No, and walking in with a game in the form that you could get it cheaply in 1979, right? In a little bag. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other thing about the modules that Richard creates is he's always working on new mechanics, and that's typically they're all kind of workshops for trying new ideas, and he'll come up with a story or a plot line and say, well, hey, wouldn't it be great if this or that? And one of the things I liked in the Valley of the Five Fires module was he had right, it could be it was a huge sandbox setting, more than a module. So you had all these side adventures that could occur, and you had an encounter like a sliding scale, where is your PC party, what level are they at? Well, then you sort of scale up or scale back the number of bandits they encounter, and different ways to approach those sort of problems, and trying to come up with mechanics that worked well and felt right at the table.
Yeah, it's actually the idea that he's talking about specifically is there's a bandit lair, and it's laid out in such a way that there's a 3-column chart, so that if your characters are like levels 3 through 5, you use the first column for all the encounters, and if they're levels like 4 through 6, you use the middle, and so on. And it's this sort of sliding scale thing. That was really one of the inventions in that, which I'd like to use in other places. And anyway, that's specifically what he's talking about when he's saying that.
No, that's really cool, and it sounds like you guys are not hard up for ideas. I probably need to wrap this up if you don't mind.
Sure.
That's fine.
I want to thank you for your time. We've been here for just shy of 2 hours, and I've had a great time talking to you guys. And I hope that you've enjoyed the opportunity to talk about your game, the Sandbox Companion,
Absolutely.
and also the other things.
It's been wonderful, actually. Thank you very much for having us. It's been great.
You're welcome. David and Richard, again, thank you for your time, and may come back to you at some point later and talk about the system, which I have purchased, printed out, and started to look at.
All right, I appreciate it.
All right, very good. Have a great night.
Good night.
Bye.